America Salutes You, and this is the weekend when we're doing our fourth annual, it'll be a nationally broadcast benefit concert, and the beneficiaries are veterans and first responder charities that particularly focus on brain and mental wellness, and that's a phrase that I feel very comfortable with, and I hope the experts here agree with it, because there have been other ways that it's been phrased over the years, but I wait to be educated on that. As you know, the concert will be this evening here as part of the Wonderfront Music Festival. I'm really honored and happy to be associated with them. But it's always been our feeling that it's not good enough just to have a one-off concert. It's not good enough to even have a concert that's nationally broadcast. And by the way, this will be broadcast on the CW TV network. It'll be on December 27th, so it'll be 100% national coverage. And the idea is to then get people around the country to donate to the charity. So 100% of the donations that come in, either through a text to donate or through online donations, will then go to a variety of charities that help both first responders and veterans and their families. But there needs to be a policy aspect to this that backs up doing the entertainment aspect of it. And so that's why we're doing the policy roundtable. It's going to be a working lunch, so I'm glad everybody's going to be well fed, and we have an amazing panel discussion. And what we do is we film it among the honorees here, and very minor edits, and then we post it on our website as an open source material. So I believe this is the fourth one that we will have had. And we really are interested in some of the latest breakthroughs and information in brain and mental wellness. And I have my partner here is Marie Dyack with the Entertainment Industries Council, and Marie has been at this a long time, and I'm really so happy that we're doing this together. So Marie, can I turn it over to you to introduce the panelists? And I know we have a couple with time constraints, and so we'll take it from there. And we hope that the audience, once they hear the presentations, which will be relatively brief, will engage in the Q&A. So, Marie. Oh, I should mention one other thing. We have two microphones, and initially we're going to get everyone a lavalier. When they told us what the cost was, we went to our recording studio as friends, so these are free. But as you can see, they're a little bit analog. We got the cords and one for each of our panelists to share, so make sure you share the mic.
Thank you, Bob. And it's been my pleasure to work with Bob, the vision that he has, not just for the engagement with the concerts, which I found out from last year are fun, they're rowdy, and everybody has a great time, but also to have this opportunity to talk about policy and practices and the people we all care about and what we hope to achieve. I'd mentioned that in my early years in this work, through shelter care for adolescent girls in particular, I was told that when you find unlikely partners, you might find better solutions. And so that is our goal today. Some of you knew each other, some of you don't, but to take a look at other possibilities as we move forward. So I'd like to go ahead, the floor will be, I'm going to introduce the panelists and then ask for their comments. I have some questions, and then we open it up for Q&A. Inserted in there, we're going to ask the people around the table to identify who you are and where you're from. This is not a commercial break, it's just name and association. And then, so everyone knows to whom they're speaking. All right, so we'll start with Dr. Sharon. This is pretty remarkable. Dr. Sharon was appointed by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors as the County Director of Mental Health. Leads the largest public mental health system in the country, something I was not aware of, the largest one in the country, serving over 250,000 clients annually in the most populous and one of the most ethnically diverse counties in the nation. We also have with us today Patrick Dollard, President and CEO of the Center for Discovery. It's been designated a New York State Center for Excellence in the care and treatment of children with complex disabilities, medical frailties, and autism spectrum disorders. And I'm underscoring the complex disabilities, which could never be understated. Dr. Albert Skip Rizzo, the head of USC Creative Technology Center, a psychologist and a recognized leader in using virtual reality in mental health. Lots of questions about that. Dr. Tina Atherall, the CEO of Psych Armor Institute. The Institute offers courses to help caregivers balance their caregiving duties along with their need for self-care, often a population that's skipped over, at least in the meetings I go to. And Stan Collins, Suicide Prevention and Media Representative for San Diego County Suicide Prevention Council. And he heads up the State Youth Film Competition, Directing Change, where young people, high school and college age, produce video, kind of like the PSA video and short stories from their perspective. And Stan, thank you all for joining us. Quickly go around the room.
My name is Caitlin Dollard. I am Patrick's youngest daughter, so I'm here to support him.
My name is Dr. Carrie Rogers, and I'm with Psych Armor Institute.
My name is Judith Howell, and I'm with Psych Armor Institute as well.
My name is Erin Brzezinski, and I'm a third here with Psych Armor Institute.
Excuse me, I'm Michael Rosen, the Executive Vice President at the Center for Discovery.
I'm Hank Linderman from Falls of Rough, Kentucky. In 2018, I was the Democratic nominee for Congress in Kentucky's 2nd District, and I've filed to run again this year already. So.
I'm Debbie Gregory. I'm a proud member of the America Salute You team since the beginning, and I'm CEO of Veterans and Military Business Owners Association.
I'm Jane Rosen. Yeah, I'm with the Center for Discovery.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Thank you, and please get some lunch. We're going to start with Dr. Sharon, and then I will have a few questions for him, and then we will continue on the rest of the panel, about 5 or 10 minutes each, and more questions. So, Dr. Sharon.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And it's an honor to be here with you all and with this great panel. I will say that occupational therapy is a underutilized and underrecognized field that is critically important, and I think some of my comments will reflect that. You know, just a little bit about my career. I'm actually a psychiatrist, also a neurobiologist. I spent most of my career working in the VA. I ran mental health for the West Los Angeles VA campus and then for the Miami VA healthcare system before going into the nonprofit world for a period of time. And now I'm back in a lumbering bureaucracy known as Los Angeles County. And I say that with love. I'm also the son of a combat vet. My uncle's a combat vet. My grandfather a combat vet in England. And I guess that a lot of the experiences of those three fine men and my family kind of reflect, I think, some of the drive that I have to work with this community. Despite being a psychiatrist and a neurobiologist, I think the way that I look at what I call mental health and well-being, so that's a little something to think about, Bob. We can talk at some point. Is not really kind of a typical way for, you know, medical doctors to talk about these issues. And the two phenomena that I really want to just mention briefly really are independence and connectedness as kind of the core pillars of what I would call well-being, or a term that was coined by Aristotle many, many years ago called eudaimonia. Which really many have kind of described as the highest order human endeavor. And it's not just about being happy, and it's not just about being productive. It's about the whole shebang. So if we get back to independence, when I think about independence and when I am spending time developing systems and programs and working with individual people, which I still do in the streets of Los Angeles, where we have a lot of folks, particularly in Skid Row, although all over the place, there really are three core elements to independence, and you could argue about them, and there may be many more. But really, I think about physical, emotional, and intellectual capacities as critical for independence. And if you think about those three arenas, and you recognize that an individual with identity and with agency in those three areas is largely going to be independent. Now, of course, when I try to teach young psychiatrists about this, and they're like, you know, hey, what are you talking about? Help me out with the medications and the combinations, and what about their mental health diagnosis? These are all really critical things. But in the context of helping someone go from being dependent to independent, you have to think in a very large way about what that means. So that's the independence piece. And many would say, oh, well, being independent and being connected are kind of diametrically opposed. But they're in fact not. A fully independent person has every right and every opportunity to be connected. So what does connectedness mean? And the three domains of connectedness that I recognize and think about and teach about and try to develop systems and programs around are really family and kinship, community and society, and then cosmos, or the spiritual realm. And the thing about each of those arenas is, does an individual have purpose and belonging in each of those three domains? Because if they do, they're connected. And an individual that is fully independent and is fully connected has a great opportunity to flourish. The work that I've done in the VA, in the nonprofit world, and now at the county is in many ways focusing on the connectedness piece, which is an area of great, I think, opportunity. And I would say really kind of reflects upon what regions of our world around the globe do well in delivering mental health care, and that we don't do in this country. And that is to recognize the importance of purpose and belonging. And when we talk about the reintegration challenges of any population, and particularly the military combination, we can understand why that's an issue. Because individuals that are in the military community engage, and they have the military community as a family. And they have a mission. And that mission is shared. And those are sacred aspects of an individual and their relationship and their connectedness to the rest of the world. And after service, those things can disintegrate. And you come back to a place where maybe your family is not in good shape, or you haven't been communicating, you haven't been connected, whether it's your kids, your spouse, your parents, cousins, anybody. And what about your relationship to your community and to society? Well, maybe your education is no longer relevant, or maybe your the training that you've been engaged in is no longer available, or the job market that you had left isn't there. Maybe those people, those institutions that you engaged before you left are actually no longer interested in you, or simply not attractive. And then at the spiritual level, or at the cosmic level, what have you been through? What have you seen? And many of you are aware of the work in moral injury, which is something that I've done a lot of stuff on. And actually, we had a major conference and summit in Los Angeles County around moral injury, not just for the military community, but for other communities with a great deal of trauma, and people who are challenged with their thought system, their belief system, what they understand to be right and to be wrong. Now, all of these things get tested and in many ways fractured in the context of military service, clearly with combat and even without combat. And the one thing I'll tell you before handing over the mic or maybe answering questions really is an effort that I got approval or authorization from the Board of Supervisors to proceed with last week, which is called the Veteran Peer Access Network. This is something I've been working on for in one way or another for about 10 years. And that is to recognize that veterans, when they come back, are civic assets and leaders, and that we, in our communities, need to give them platforms for purpose and belonging, and that they can continue to serve. And there are wonderful nonprofit organizations that do this. And locally, in El Segundo, there's Team Rubicon, led by a major leader named Jake Wood. And there are many, many others. But they recognize this opportunity and its importance to healing and to well-being, and frankly, to mental health. And the VPAN really, what it is it's an effort to bring veterans back and to create a workforce development initiative that will hire vets, and we're going to be hiring about 100 vets. About half of them will be working in the county. About half of them will be working in community-based organizations. And they will be a team. And they will be a team that is focused on their mission, which is to function as battle buddies, helping to rescue and support and bring to resource those who are languishing in Los Angeles County, in many ways around being homeless and or suicidal. And we all know that there's a big vortex that leads to those scenarios, and we want to intervene. And we know that vets engage vets in a way that's quite special. And what I would say is that there's an accountability framework built into this approach that I think is long overdue, because this team will be accountable to itself across the county and across organizations. And by the way, the VA, Long Beach VA and the Greater Los Angeles VA are all in with us. And they have a lot of veterans who are functioning as peers that are hired to be a part of it, which is a big deal, because it's not about just working for your organization, going and doing your outreach and bringing people back to use your resource. It's about functioning as a battle buddy, connecting with someone that has resource needs, and getting them to those resources no matter where they are, whether they're at the county, whether at the VA, whether they're at the state, whether at one of the nonprofits, or maybe at one of the academic institutions. And those areas that deliver when someone is brought to the door, we would like to think will grow. And those systems that are not delivering will actually be visible and can be accountable, so that we can really move the system. And I would argue as a last thought that we have an opportunity to leverage this model to bring back veterans, employ them, revere them as disciplined people who function in teams and have a greater work ethic than other populations as a general statement, to uplift our health and human services across the space, not just in the military community. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I appreciate the sense, too, the undercurrent that I heard about connection. And throughout this conversation, I'm sure that's going to keep coming up again. And when people feel not connected, and that's a terrible place. I have a couple of specific questions before we open up, maybe for just quick. What keeps people from seeking help? What, in terms of a misunderstanding about mental health? And I know that's a huge conversation, but is there something that just keeps bubbling up?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why people don't reach out to get mental health care. Starting with the system itself, which is not particularly inviting and welcoming as a general rule, and which can be traumatic for individuals that kind of touch it. There's also a great deal of stigma around mental health and mental illness, and the issue of weakness as opposed to illness and need for help. And that's true around, you know, if you want to call pure mental illness and pure addictions, or you want to talk about behavioral health as a combination. I would say in the military community, this is particularly profound because of the army of one mentality, which is like, you know, I am a tough person, I'm well trained, I am invincible, and I can get through this myself. At the same time that all of the disconnection can occur and all of the challenges to identity and agency that I had described happen at the individual level. Individuals are unable to get employed. They're not, getting access to enough resources and funding to have a place to live. Addictions creep in. Legal problems start to mount. And those, I mean, I think that's a pattern we've seen again and again, and that we need to really recognize and go after.
What's one of the key elements you see that's going to be essential for the success of any kind of reintegration when it comes to aftercare? If someone is receiving specific mental health care or a substance use disorder, what needs to be present in that aftercare conversation?
Well, it's a great question, and I like to talk about the term resources is a big term, big R. And really, resources for me is services, but also opportunities. Again, when you have people that want meaning in their lives and that have capacity, you need to give them opportunities. So I talked about developing platforms for individuals who are service-oriented to come back and to continue serving. So I would suggest that aftercare is moving from full service towards full opportunity, and that's a continuum that needs to be very individualized and to recognize the assets and leverage the assets of an individual person in their ecosystem.
Along those lines with the aftercare and the continuum, healthcare, people who are in healthcare and a lot of people in this room, how do we take care of them?
Well, boy,
they burn out?
this is a big question. And, you know, the Department of Mental Health in LA County has about 6,000 employees. It's a big workforce. And they are not working in great conditions. And I mean that in terms of the actual physical plant, the bureaucracy, which is, you know, daunting. The difficulty of the work itself, because there are a lot of people who are very, very sick. There are a lot of people who are very, very traumatized, and we know that a lot of that experience is absorbed in the course of, you know, of work, and we, I believe, have a responsibility to look after the mental health and well-being of our front lines, of our trench, in order for them to pay forward the work and the care, and what we call in LA County a heart-forward approach. There are a number of programs that are available, some in real time, face-to-face, some, and maybe Skip can talk about this, that are technology-based to help individuals and equip individuals to succeed on the front lines, whether it's a headspace to, you know, relax and end up kind of getting thoughts together, whether it's training through a Psych Armor type approach. But we, you know, and there are things that that we, you know, as providers can do, and we also have to recognize that you know, in order for us to continue to get people engaged who are going to be delivering really high quality service and to keep them, their jobs have to be compensated properly, and they need the time to process what they've gone through. And I don't think that we do that, and I think, you know, it's particularly apparent when you run a Department of Mental Health and you feel like you're not able to look after the mental health of your own providers. And I do think there's a growing recognition of that unaddressed need, and I would hope that we can do more about it. There are a number of initiatives I won't get into in LA County that are going after the strategies that I'm describing right now for our workforce.
I appreciate that, and we're going to hold questions until all the panel is complete, but thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Well, thank you very much. You know, speaking of family and connectedness, I'm going to get in my truck and drive up the coast to see my daughter, who's here from New York, studying social work, and it's Thanksgiving time. Thank you all very, very much.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
The quick perspective of the center is it really grew out of the big institutions closing some 40 years ago. I'm 39 years at the place, and I think it's mental health in the DD world, all of the different complexities we manage, that we're full of biases and all kinds of judgments on populations we care for. So I got that firsthand when I carried naked bodies out of Willowbrook and realizing that people had condemned them to be vegetables and single-digit IQs. And I think the center early on said, you know, this disability-centric bullshit is just not the way we're going to work, and we saw people. And it's evolved where I understand what are the underlying things: stress, anxiety, all the kinds of things that have aligned us with the 82nd Airborne, the Alzheimer's population, that we have so much more, our work in brain health, we have so much in common with everybody. And if we can And that's why I love this group today, is that if we can cross over and get out of our own, the lanes that the world has been in for too long. Trauma is trauma, whether it's a kid with autism or a soldier coming back. And you know, with that, when you science it up, we talk about staff and the importance of staff being able to win. And so you have to smart or science the shit out of it, really, to assist them so they anticipate and they feel they can come to work and thrive instead of just custodialize a problem. And we're doing that. We have a little VR stuff. I'm going to mess with Skip. He's a big VR guy. But we have a particular project now because in New York, one of the things they developed is this Justice Center thing where they put a whole bunch of ex-DAs and cops to go after programs where things happen. And we finally convinced them that you don't want to criminalize accidents and things. When you deal with complex people, things happen. And we actually created a VR program where they could put on the equipment and see stuff in real time. And all of a sudden, they want us to train up their people. So I'm excited about that. And that goes right back to your staff, where staff, when they feel you're taking care of them and you're covering them and you're telling the truth about the complexities of the job, they feel, you know, they'll work even harder. So I think as we evolved at the center, we deal with really complex kids. We're the largest pediatric provider in New York for kids with complexities, both medically fragile and autism. And we also have a very complex adult program. And I think across the country, one of the things that we're attempting to do with our research institute is get after the architecture of care and really rethink how you could advance care with populations that we've never seen before. You know, longevity in the DD world. In 1980, the lifespan of a person with Down syndrome was 25 years of age. Today, it's 70. It's like crazy. And so we're experiencing all of the longevity issues with a complex population, and that brings us so close to typical aging. And so we've been able to partner with all kinds of people that only 10 years ago, no one would ever talk to each other. And you know, we have a very robust research institute, and we have people from all over the, you know, research universities joining us to really speak across lines. And that's our work with the VA, particularly the 82nd Airborne, those cats. And you know, he talked about the Rubicon group. I biked from Arlington to Gettysburg with the Center for Discovery team, and the Rubicon team beat us, and I'm still upset with that. That will not happen next year. 30 years ago, we thought food is medicine. We actually trademarked food as medicine. And so we have our own biodynamic farming program where we grow food for about 1,800 meals a day, so it's a big operation. And we're now 4 or 5 years into growing hemp biodynamically, and we think there's some real value in plant-based pharma, particularly for mental health issues, because we know traditional pharma just, it sucks for the most part. Some of it's good. I don't want to get too crazy. But plant-based pharma, we have a research project with the US Ag. We're growing the Charlotte's Web. We're trying to get a seed that works in New York. And then we're looking at the product grown biodynamically, and we're finding some interesting stuff. We have a medicinal marijuana study going with NYU Orrin Devinsky for folks with intractable seizures. So we're in that lane to really look at plant-based pharma, because I think there's a future there that would be so much more accommodating all of us. And so I think that's a quick take on our show. You know, again, I think when you look at workforce just across all kinds of care agencies, whether it's nursing home, hospital care, this is a complicated deal, even finding folks. So centers have to invest a hell of a lot more in staff training and support to really deal with folks. And, I think the beauty of this kind of energy, as crazy as it is, I think there's a movement to really, get to the point we can help people get better.
Yeah.
It's not just custodializing something or just hanging on or, the middle of the road stuff. I think we can get folks a lot better, and that's going to require a lot of rethink, where people live, how they live. There's got to be a lot more to it, and so we're hoping to be part of that. And again, I'm happy to be with these guys on the panel.
And just before you pass the mic down, I just had one question. I know we've had conversations about some research you're familiar with, particularly those in the military who are shooting, and some of that percussion and concussion that affects, as you call it, the plumbing of the neck and the spinal fluid. And
the Atlas.
I'd love to hear just a moment about that.
The Atlas is what holds your head on top of your spine, and if that's got some kind of angling to it, it stops the flow of spinal fluid. And the very important thing about spinal fluid, particularly when you're sleeping, it flushes your heavy metals, it flushes the shit out of your brain. And if that's not working, and there's some really good research, we're actually part of a little thing with the NFL, and I can't talk about that because they'll come and shoot me on that, but trauma is trauma. Yeah. And a recent study that we're looking at with C-sections, how that neck is maneuvered, some very interesting things there. So, and that's why I get back to fixing things. This is plumbing. We can fix done, and we're better, instead of trying to make it bigger than it is. And so I think you can't rule out that kind of deeper understanding of what's happening mechanically in the body, that if you get that adjusted, or you're thinking about those things, more and more possibilities come about to sort of reconcile stuff. And I think the whole deep biomedical understanding of folks, particularly on autism spectrum, this is relatively new because, the field was sort of captured by behavioralists, and we're just going to hunt down the behavior and just tame it and blame it or whatever. And boy, did they miss the damn boat. And I think now we're getting into, and they're coming along. Now it's like ABA-like, they're moving away from stuff. But that's something we always have to have in mind where, at the center we have a phrase, we think, therefore we're uncertain. Whenever I have too much certitude, I go, stop the presses. We're not seeing everything we need to know. And again, I have a brilliant staff. My daughter happens to be the best occupational therapist on earth, but she's over here in San Diego. That pisses me off, because we need her back in New York. But the other beauty of this center, and I think a lot of the folks who are here, in our 30, 40 years of work, I've seen brilliance happening in all of the different clinical disciplines in special education. Psychiatry is starting to smarten up a little bit. It's starting to think things, but we're seeing some really interesting new disciplines coming out of this, and I think that there's magic in those hills if all of a sudden we start to approach it with people going deeper and maybe creating a subset of something that looks more clearly at issues. So that's our hope at the Center for Discovery anyway.
Okay, well, thank you for having me here. Just as a quick outline, in 5 minutes, I want to try to cover 3 areas. I want to talk a little bit about the power of technology, if used effectively and thoughtfully, how that can make revolutionary changes in mental health care and physical rehabilitation. The second area I want to cover is just a little history about the work we've done serving veterans and service members using virtual reality and other methodologies for fighting off PTSD on one end, or helping veterans survive a job interview by interacting with an artificially intelligent virtual role player job interviewer. I'll make that more clear in a minute. So going from treatment all the way to transition. And then I want to underscore at the end the importance of private foundations, nonprofits, private donors for really moving technological innovation from the lab to go from bench to bedside. A lot of times the people that fund our advanced science work, they like to see publications. They like to see that we ran a clinical trial, but moving it towards wide-scale implementation in every VA or in every clinical health setting where it has relevance, a lot of times it falls on these foundations to help that transition. So those are the three areas. So first area, technology. There's a lot of fears of technology. There's, particularly with AI, there's a lot of concerns that we're dehumanizing healthcare by implementing, advanced algorithms to help inform decisions. Virtual reality, the idea of immersing people in simulations that can be designed in a way that can promote health, that can activate a process in a therapeutic setting, but in a VR setting. This offers tremendous potential. The use of mobile phones and being able to provide it, everywhere, anytime, any place, healthcare support. That is a tremendous area. Certainly, there's a lot of research to be done, but a lot of it has already been done. So I got started in this area as a clinical psychologist working in brain injury rehab, totally doing clinical work. And one day, one of my 22-year-old clients came in, frontal lobe injured individual from a car accident, and I couldn't motivate him for more than 5 minutes on any kind of a traditional rehab workbook, paper and pencil exercise. He comes in my office and he goes, "Skip, look at this, it's a new thing." I go, "What do you got?" He goes, "It's a Game Boy." This is like 1990 or so. And so I go, "What does it do?" And he goes, "Watch." And I watch him and he's playing Tetris. And he was like laser focused on this thing, glued to it. I'm watching him for like 15 minutes, and I'm also noticing he's like a Tetris warlord. He was great at it. And that was the light bulb for me. It was like, if we can harness, whether it's the game-based element, the interactivity, and engage people in things, and not make it so boring, repetitive, and frustrating with traditional methods, then we can move forward. So long story short, in '95, had the opportunity, after writing a few papers on implementation of VR, and just to put it in a nutshell, think of this metaphor. Think of just like an aircraft simulator would test and train piloting ability under a range of controllable conditions. We can design VR environments that test, train, teach, or treat human function similarly, and we can do it now the technology's caught up, in a $300-400 headset without a computer. That all the processing is being done on that headset. So we can create simulations that are emotionally evocative or present challenges in ways that are engaging to help people learn, grow, recover, maintain their wellness. So 95, the technology was really primitive. Had I known how bad it was, I might have chickened out and stayed in clinical practice. But incrementally, the technology has evolved to where we are now, where the technology has in fact caught up with the vision. And what I mean by that is technology is high fidelity for delivering VR and networked connections. Graphics are better, the interactivity is better, the usability of these systems is better, and they're low cost. It's not like you have to have a $20,000 lab-based setup to do this kind of work. You can do it on a $200 to $400 standalone VR headset now. So over the years, along the way, myself and a group, maybe about 50, 100 people around the world had the same kind of vision. And a lot of research was generated where we showed the science, even with primitive technology, the science where this could make a difference for people, helping to expose people with phobias to the things that they fear, like fear of flying or fear of public speaking in a VR simulation, and doing it in the office in a way where by confronting their fear, eventually that fear extinguishes or dissipates. Same thing with the PTSD work. The training, you can put people in simulations that help them to confront and reprocess difficult emotional memories. The work we're doing started with autism for job interview training, now moving into veterans and incarcerated juvenile delinquents who never been on a job interview. these kinds of interactive technologies have grown and evolved. So I could make the case that in mental health and rehabilitation, we probably have the most evolved scientific literature of any use case for virtual reality and augmented reality. I use those terms kind of interchangeably. So we're at a point now where the technology is low cost and available. And so what we did in 2005, we've got our first bit of funding from the Office of Naval Research to build out what's called a prolonged exposure approach to PTSD. And again, it might sound like torture at first, but you're basically asking a patient to go back and imagine and talk about the worst stuff that they ever went through, but in a safe place. And by doing that repeatedly with a good clinician trained in this area, they get better. And so our idea was, let's create virtual reality simulations where you can put on a headset and now you're back in that Humvee, or you're walking on a foot patrol in an Afghan village, or remote mountain outpost in Afghanistan, or any of these variety of worlds. And we evolved this system where it could be customized. A clinician is always in the loop. It's not self-help, it's not AI-driven. The clinician is controlling the time of day in the simulation. A bomb went off over here while the patient's narrating their story. There were no people in the marketplace, or the marketplace was teeming with people. Click, change it up. So you can customize this in real time. Well, anyway, we found by doing this repeated graduated exposure that we saw statistically significant reductions in PTSD symptoms and clinically meaningful gains, which are two separate things, where it made a difference. And people, once they got better at the end of treatment, they engaged in life more and continue to get better at 3, 6, and 1 year follow-up. So, this now, fast forward 15 years, evidence-based approach. We've gone through 3 different software iterations as the software has evolved and gotten better. And the funny thing, or the sad thing about it, was that we got a lot of benefit from the Department of Defense early on. The urgency of the problem, which they recognized, drove the funding to be able to create some of these things. I always like to say war sucks, but it always drives innovation in physical healthcare, emergency, battlefield medicine, coming into the emergency room in civilian care. And these, post 9/11 wars, I think, will be known as the wars that drove innovation in technology applications for healthcare. And that's a good news story. And there's a lot of this with war. Most people don't realize that the National Institute of Mental Health was formed in 1947 on an executive order by Harry Truman to address combat neurosis. That was it. And that changed everything. The VA set up a clinical internship program in 1949 because we were being overrun by people from World War II with PTSD, but it wasn't called that then, and it overran psychiatry. So let's train psychologists who traditionally just give tests and do research. Let's train them in clinical arts. So the VA drove the birth of the field of clinical psychology. So, you see these innovations, and I think these wars and the impact of them, the needs, have driven the advances in technology. So that's the good story. And we've gotten the funding to build these different things. We've addressed military sexual trauma. We've developed pre-deployment, cognitive processing, resilience training things. But what happened was the wars have tapered down. The DoD's urgency has kind of diminished a little bit. And the funding is nowhere near what it was for any of these things. And to the point where we needed to do a software update in 2016 to make all of our software for PTSD relevant and usable by these low-cost systems. And it wasn't a lot of money. It was maybe a couple $100,000 to, optimize all the software, make it run faster, better, higher resolution, stereo. And the Army, I sent in a proposal, and one reviewer said, "Oh, are we going to have to pay for software updates every 5 years?" And it's like, well, kinda, yeah. And there was no funding to take an evidence-based approach that was running on old software, on old equipment, to the next level to make it more accessible, cheaper, more available. So that's when I learned about Infinite Hero Foundation at the Oakley Sunglasses group. And then, they threw in some money, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, Michael Dell from Dell Computers says, here's a check for $100 grand, let's do it. And then we're almost there, and in the last year, I'm running around with an academic tin cup, basically, trying to get money. And then out of the blue, a private foundation called Soldier Strong, who had already had a program giving out exoskeletons to patients with spinal cord injuries to help them stand and to be able to walk with these expensive and complicated devices, but effective devices. They took an interest in our work. They stepped up, they funded the rest of the development, and to boot, they're offering to any VA that wants the equipment, free equipment that they're fundraising. They have David Letterman's racing crew every time they complete a lap in an IndyCar circuit. They donate $500 to this. And so they are providing free equipment to any VA that wants it, and we provide the software for free. And that is now an illustration of, the DOD and maybe the VA is great at driving some initial innovation, but to get it over the finish line and to get it out there, I can't underscore the importance of private foundations and nonprofits and the work that people do because they have passion. They don't have to do it. They have passion to make a difference. And that has helped us to move what was in the lab and out at maybe 70 sites around the country, the old version. Now we're going to have every VA have this. So my point is, fear not with technology. We're not going to replace humans with it. We're going to fill in the gaps where humans aren't available by the economics, or we're going to amplify treatment by doing it in a compelling and engaging way, and informed by science and good theory, and that we can make a difference with veteran populations and now working with police departments in New York City, similar kinds of things, first responders, firefighters. These people are confronted with trauma every day. So all the stuff we learned working with military populations, now we can make that transition. And so, there's plenty of trauma in the world. And in fact, I think, as you were saying, probably 90% of mental health conditions you can trace back to some trauma, whether it's psychological or physical trauma, whatever. And I think we have a bright future ahead with implementation of technology in a thoughtful, measured, scientifically informed, and theoretically based approach, and we can make a difference. And the importance of foundations and nonprofits to drive that last mile cannot be underestimated. It's important, it's necessary, and it makes dramatic differences. And so, anyway, that's it.
Very good.
So the one with the exoskeleton, I think that was out of the Bronx VA. Is that correct? So I just love, we're all here, thanks to Marie and Bob and this great event, but to piggyback off of where we started, it is all so relational. And it really is, these connections matter, because as I sit here and I listen to everyone talk, and Stan, meeting you when we first started today, Marie, you and I have already had that moment. I think we all have to really appreciate that these moments where we're brought together, although it may seem as though, it's because of this and the America Salutes. We are all so connected, and our work is connected. I come from the military family system. That's my story. The work chose me. I didn't choose it. And I had the wonderful honor, I just moved from New York. You're in the right place, San Diego. Sorry, I love New York. And I'm just so sad I didn't get to meet you earlier. But I'm going to go to that in a second. The exoskeleton, we had in the nonprofit that I co-founded, we would always do a run in our local communities. Initial idea around it was we're born out of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and there was this really intimate event that would happen when you'd put your loved one on a bus to go to war. And for the families, when their loved ones came back wounded, ill or injured, or killed, that process was never completed. So we started these runs as an opportunity to welcome home, have our families have some sort of ceremonial welcome home, whether it was at the end of a life and a story within the military or whatnot. Well, the great state of New York welcomed me into their family when the military sent my family there. And we started runs out on Long Island, which is a very patriotic, beautiful community. And the VA system there as well, when I was hearing so often that the VA was not approachable, that they were not collaborative, they were all these knots, they were really offering an opportunity for us to be a part of their community and be a part of the community. So our run, this Run for the Warriors, was the first run where 4 patients, not all veterans, were in this exoskeleton and completed a first race on their own. It was really incredible. I believe there was one a female Army veteran that participated in that. So that was really neat. And so I just want to say, with that relational thought, PsychArmor has the opportunity to be here today because of our great relationship with somebody by the name of Amy Johnson, who's very connected to Marie and her work. And so we have the opportunity to be here with all of you and start to hear all these great things. I'm a social worker by discipline. I also kind of thought there's probably a really funny joke. We have a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, like, I don't know, it just seems like there should be a joke around that. But, and I'm also a social work educator, and I had the opportunity in New York to work with a lot of social workers that were working in facilities or homes that had patients from Willowbrook. So it's just really neat to hear you say that, so we're connected. I can't help but not state that because I think it's beautiful. And Stan, you should have gone before me because I think your work and our work at PsychArmor is so incredibly connected. So PsychArmor Institute, in terms of speaking on this context, I could give you our line and talk about online education, 15 minutes or less, micro courses, blah, blah, blah. The best thing to say around this is that we believe and we know, for one, the reason why PsychArmor is here is because the community asked for it. There was a need, there was a pain point around something very simple. And for myself as a social worker, and then having that family, I was the token military family member that was a social worker in a community, and they all said, we don't understand your community. Social workers were like, we see a lot of you, but we don't know you, so what does that mean? So my life spent a lot of time in community engagements through social work profession, training social workers. Well, guess what? PsychArmor is all about creating that education for community members. That's where it started. So I have to say, on our roundtable here are really the people who make the work happen. So my colleagues here, Dr. Carrie Rogers has been the individual who has built this organization along the way and comes from the VA. And again, some of the great reasons as to why we are who we are is because along that education route, not only was the community initially asking for it, but the individuals that were what we call SMEs, right? Those subject matter experts that had a vast amount of information to share. Like, I'm thinking, why haven't we shared your work? Like, you need a 15-minute last course, like, out there, like, so the world can see. Because I'm also thinking, like, everything I learned, like, it was you. Like, I'm thinking, going, oh my God, it was because of you. But we have these amazing experts in the field, or even amazing individuals like Medal of Honor recipients that have experienced something, that want to share something. And so we are the place in which the experts in the field are able to come and address a pain point via education. And what does education do for us in the very smallest, most simplest forms? Is it creates a conversation, which is why I loved what you said. You go out, you get these big speeches, but then you take it into a smaller place in which people can communicate. So if you think about it, I'm sure many of you have heard that concept around the military-civilian divide, that bridging that gap. That conversation has been talked about also from within our Army, with our warrior policy on the Sea of Goodwill, and that Americans want to help, they just don't know how. We talk about this in many different ways. So in the simplest form, PsychArmor has one course that we're really curious about, and it's Tipping Point. And it's a course called 15 Things Veteran Wants You to Know, which was designed by Carrie in the room here, which I love, and Aaron's colleague, Dr. Heidi Kraft, who is a Navy psychologist. They go through 15 things that veterans, when asked, want their community members to know. And the very first thing is, we aren't all soldiers. Now, one of the things when I first looked at the course as a coming from the community, and I was an educator at the time, I utilized Psych Armor courses in the classroom, I thought, are we still having this conversation? And the truth is we are. And it's a very important conversation, that cultural conversation to have amongst communities in whatever format we can. So we work cross-sector, and when I say that, we work in healthcare industry, so we work with healthcare providers. We have an entire portfolio of courses that are really geared towards individuals that are working with military veterans and their families. It is great for all civilians. This is where like our tie will come into. Evidence-based practice for a civilian is the same as a military service member or their family member. There's just an additional story layered over top of that, which is Carrie's expertise and her team and Erin's to make sure that we are telling and training our healthcare providers. Guess where our other large sector is? Employers. Why? Because there's a lot of incentives from employers across the country to hire our veterans. So with that incentive, we like to challenge, are they actually doing their jobs well? And amongst those incentives, I mean, we don't say that. But what we do is through our employer's portfolio, we have an opportunity to help employers with their hiring practices. A lot of times D&I teams are using it. So there are tools and resources through 15 minutes or less, which is what we know is a really great window for educational opportunity, right? And this is where I'm also thinking for you, and I hope Carrie's mind has been popping in a million different directions. So we're connected through USC, and I invested in USC for my doctoral education because they wanted to train social workers in innovation and leadership. And guess what I learned about? AI. And so I think when I even heard Dr. Sharon start talking is like we do a disservice to ourselves by sticking in our discipline. So I've had the opportunity as a social worker because of the academic institution that I invested in and that invested in saying social workers should not only be talking to social workers within their agencies, we should be talking to these individuals who are also working within technology. AI has a really strong piece for our educational, and I'm pointing to you, Carrie, because she and I are like, how are we supposed to be using AI? But sometimes in the nonprofit sector, we don't have that capability or that capacity, or are we the experts to do it? So when Marie first asked us to come on board here, we had this opportunity for Amy, and she said, maybe a project will spark from this. And I'm like, ooh, technology? And then I was also thinking teens and storytelling. Like, there is so much that we need to do together. So I could go on and on and on in a gazillion different ways, but I do want to just bring up in terms of our introduction around our work with caregivers. So through our growth, we are now have been around for 5 years, which I like to keep saying that's a very important milestone for a nonprofit, because only 43% of us make it to our 5th year, and that's with great support. We have been well supported by this effort throughout the years, and we're very grateful for that. But throughout that time, if you go back to what I said, we have identified and addressed pain points. And so guess what? Our military community has also said that education will be, we need that. So we've followed along with our DOL and DOD, Department of Labor, Department of Defense, our VA partners around that transition piece, that really key piece during the transition, which is now backing up further, but we learn a lot in the 1 to 2 weeks that we get Death by PowerPoint through a great set of programs. But there was a beautiful investment for our philanthropic partners at Schultz Family Foundation to build out courses that would go in line with the TAP process. So what does technology do? It allows us to put it on our platform where if you're at home late at night and you're like, dang, I got to go for that interview tomorrow. What did I learn during the TAP process? Oh, I remember they said Psych Armor would continue to hold our hand down the road. We have those courses that they can access any time of the day, et cetera, et cetera. I think you guys all get my point on that. Our work with caregivers is extremely important. We do that work in line with our partners at the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, at the VA, et cetera. But it's Erin's here, and she could probably share some really beautiful stories in that it's not just about, go take this course, and you're going to be a better person. Erin's going to be following up with the caregivers after they have synced in. We see that there's a completion, and just follow up and see if there's any additional resources or learning or support that we can provide, as well as make sure that they're attached attached to the other individuals or organizations that are doing great work in our community. So I'm going to just close in saying it really is all relational, gang. We have to keep it at that level. It really does matter at no matter how big of the problem is, if we got to stay connected in that point, and it's so important that we're staying connected. And I think now it gets to be your turn.
I would just say I love the connectivity in that PsychArmor was a beneficiary from one of our early concerts and now is leading the discussion in our policy roundtable. So that was terrific. So, Marie, can I give it back to you?
Sure. Stana, you have an interesting perspective when you have young people creating film and using language, which I know you've been very involved in, using non-discriminatory language. So.
And actually, I will end on the youth focus, but I have a few different focuses. So specifically, I work in suicide prevention. I'm a suicide loss survivor. I worked in suicide prevention for about 20 years now. And so my focuses are around youth suicide prevention. I do a lot of work with first responders and military. And so I wanted to touch on a few things. I'm actually also in process with the Coast Guard Reserve right now. And when you talk about the cultural divide between civilians and military, sadly, when I tell most people that I'm trying to get into the Coast Guard Reserve, the reaction I get from most of my friends is not supportive. Why would you do that? Why would you risk everything that you've built in your life? And my simple response is, no, I'm going in to earn everything that I've got. But there's very few people in my life that are 100% behind me going into the Coast Guard. So that is a huge part of the divide right there. But I think when it comes to, and again, I apologize, but I'm going to speak specifically to suicide and suicide prevention throughout my comments. But first off, when it comes, one of the issues around military and suicide prevention is the messaging. The call to action, 22 veterans a day die by suicide, was great to raise awareness, but it's a very dangerous message that we're sending to people. It's similar to saying, there's another statement out there that's very dangerous. LGBTQ plus youth or individuals are 3 to 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. And so what that message inadvertently says is there's something inherently defective with being a veteran, with being LGBTQ. And so one of the big things we have to do is hold ourselves accountable with our messages. Now, that being said, there are a few unique characteristics about military service, similar to first responders, that can increase risk of suicide, such as if they have seen combat, their fear of life and death, their perceptions of life and death, their fear of death can be reduced. If they used a firearm in their role, that can increase their capabilities. So there are some factors that can increase risk, but it's not an inherent risk. Just because you are a veteran does not mean you will have PTSD, does not mean you will think about suicide. So I think how we message is important. And a lot of my work that I do in suicide prevention, I should also clarify I'm not a mental health professional, and I got a little intimidated when I was the only one that didn't have doctor as we were going down the way. Thanks. But one of the important pieces that I find is that when it comes specifically to suicide, most mental health professionals that I speak to say that their training in suicide assessment and ongoing care was very limited. And most of the focus was on assessment. Should this person or should they not go to the hospital? Not how are we caring for this person in the long term? And many of the treatments, quote unquote treatments that we throw at suicidality are actually mental health treatments. They're not suicide treatments. We put people in the hospital for 72 hours, but in the hospital they're treating them for mental health. They find a diagnosis and they treat that. They're not necessarily automatically doing safety planning and caring connections and lethal means counseling. And so there are some big gaps in how we care. We need to stop using a hammer for every nail, because it's just not the way that it is when it comes to suicide risk. And I think to do that, one of my focuses when I work with military, first responders, community, youth, teachers, whoever, is that we really have to start addressing the philosophical element of suicidality. It is not always mental health. It is not always mental illness. And until we brace that there is a philosophical element to suicide, we have to acknowledge that the only person who chooses whether someone lives or dies by suicide is that individual. Earlier, Dr. Sharon was talking about individuality and independence. And what we do to treat suicidality is we take away all the individuality. We take away all the independence. And so much of the treatment is actually increasing risk. And this is very prevalent in the military. I do a lot of safety stand-downs. In the military, I think when we talk about veteran suicide, I think we need to do a better job of supporting suicide prevention before they become veterans. And what I mean by that is in the military, there's such a press the red button mentality. If they say suicide here in San Diego, they go immediately to Balboa Hospital. We know that the hospitalization process is traumatizing, and so I've been able to chip away at it, but what I'm trying to get them to understand is that by using that system that they have, people aren't going to stop being suicidal. They're just going to stop talking about suicide, which is actually going to increase suicide risk. So there's some things that we can change in that system. Finally, to get to the point that you actually invited me here to talk about. Sorry, I was just getting on my soapbox a little bit about how we address suicide in the military, but with youth. When we look at the California Healthy Kids Survey data, we know that military youth report higher levels of suicidality and suicide attempts. And unfortunately, school systems aren't really effectively prepared to support military youth. A lot of times, it's not identified that the youth even has family members in the military, especially if they're on reserve duty or National Guard duty, and oftentimes gets missed. Here in San Diego, we do have a pretty strong military community, but there are a lot of misconceptions. But working with youth, I think the issue that we see, and this is, I think, across the board, is that for some reason, and I think it's because someone could argue that a youth death by suicide is greater than a middle-aged or older adult death by suicide. I think you could have an argument there. But youth suicide prevention gets the most funding and gets the most attention. When in reality, youth have the lowest numbers of suicides. We see the highest numbers in the middle-aged and older adult populations. But the part that we miss when we talk about the low numbers of youth suicide is the high number of youth who think about and attempt suicide. And we know that a previous attempt, unfortunately, increases risk of an attempt later in life. So in the work that I do through the Directing Change program, what we do is we invite youth to create 60-second films about mental health or suicide prevention. And it's been really fascinating to see what it is that they focus on. Because you could spend $100,000 creating a youth PSA that's written by adults, created by adults. It won't have nearly the impact of a video that's created by youth, directed by youth. And we also have a category called Through the Lens of Culture. And so we ask you to explore these topics through the lens of culture, whether that's Latino culture, jock culture, nerd culture, LGBTQ, or military culture. We actually had an amazing film from here, a youth here in San Diego a few years ago. And it was interesting as he talked about, he had a father in the military, and he had never opened up about any of his mental health issues. But through the creation of the film process, he felt that he was in a safe space with his other filmmakers, and he disclosed that he'd been having thoughts of suicide and opened up, and so we were able to connect him to help. So ultimately with the program, we're getting these amazing films, but what we're also doing is all the things that we want to teach youth about mental health and suicide prevention happens, but it happens organically. Instead of going into a classroom and talking at youth for 45 minutes, we give them all the tools to create. And we know from Bloom's taxonomy that when we create is when we really retain the information. So all the things we want them to learn, they are learning, just in a different format. So I know I jumped all over the place. I don't know if that was slightly coherent at all, but I hope that it was. And I think that I hit all my points, and I know we want to get to some questions, I think. So I'll go ahead and shut it down and pass it along.
I have so we have about 20 minutes or so to go, but I have a couple questions, but I'd like our other luncheon guests to feel free to ask some questions.
I'm one of your biggest fans. The stuff you're doing is just so innovative. Training practitioners, virtual mental health providers, recreating the trauma, which I've seen firsthand what you do. Workforce preparation. What is next is my question.
I think we're going to see more implementation of AI into whatever it is, whether it's applications on your smartphone that tracks where you go, how you use your phone, analyzes your vocal prosody as you talk on it to derive metrics about your mental wellness, which is capable. And in fact, we published a study analyzing audio recordings of suicidal adolescents versus healthy controls and saw specific vocal patterns that were different in the two groups. And that's just the beginning of a longer line of research. But that capability to quantify the self, wearables that feed into all this, and then have a virtual agent. I have one on my phone, a character, a military character, that can pop up and engage me in a dialogue about my health care, can engage me in a positive psychology type dialogue, pop up each time at 7 o'clock, all right, tell me the 3 good things that happened to you today, Well, it was a shitty day, nothing good. Come on. All right, I'm alive. I'm still breathing. I'm looking forward to the weekend. Okay, good. And simple things like that that foster a connectedness with a person, with things that reflect how they're being quantified, or with an AI agent that is always available, never tires, is engaging. We still haven't cracked the humor thing. Virtual humans don't make very good comedians, but you need humor in some of this once in a while, so we're making some lame efforts at that. But there's a double-edged sword to that, because everything I said in terms of just a mobile connection is really good, except, well, what about my privacy? What if my system gets hacked and 5 years of me interacting with this AI software goes to an insurance company or worse or whatever? Can I really trust this? So these are all the challenges. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, and I see AI probably being, aside from, there's so much focus now in just general society about replacing workers, retraining, and so on with automation. We're going to have the same firestorm in psychology as the technology gets better, where people propose virtual therapists, not just healthcare guides, battle buddies, support agents, but therapists. And you could make a case that if software gets better, it never tires. It has encyclopedic knowledge. It can sense how much you've walked from your Fitbit or how your sleep is, and update that information in a way a clinician could never do. But is there something about that human back and forth interaction that we're going to sacrifice? So it'll be the most contentious issue, I think, in the next 5-10 years of psychology. But also, if used thoughtfully, I think will make a difference on top of all the VR, AR, augmented reality stuff. That's the other thing. World Health Organization, 60% of people in the world that have mental health problems never see the inside of a therapy office. Breaking down barriers to care, destigmatizing, making it more accessible, affordable, and boosting the anticipated benefit. Because a lot of times, veterans, you hear this all the time, oh, yeah, I'm going to go to therapy and talk about what I went through. That's really going to help. They don't expect that helps. So there's all these barriers to care that I think we can address, but we got to be very mindful of how it could go awry if not well done.
And
That's what I have to say next.
Patrick, I wonder if I could ask you about some of the work you were doing with wearable technologies, and then secondarily some of the work that you're doing with the 82nd Airborne.
Yeah, well, the wearable technologies, we have probably the longest study in the world with physiologic factors affecting kids who are on the spectrum, where we now can anticipate behaviors because we're reading what are underlying, physiology going on, body temperature, all kinds of heart rate. And so we're really learning a great deal, and we hope to be able to get that in front of teachers and clinicians where they can have a readout and they can see that Johnny's going to have a fit here quickly, so pay attention to it. So it's it'll be published probably in a year or so, but it's almost 15 years of work that's going to finally come out. I think, we have a very big tech part of the center. We have a piece of like a hoverboard platform that we won a big award with Google, and they helped us develop and design this, where it's a 35-pound motorized wheelchair, so helps people with manual wheelchairs click up on it, and they're off and running. Airbus may buy it for all the airports around the world, and I hope as we talk about we need philanthropy, we really do. Government, DOD actually does some good stuff, but you got to stay after them. But I think we need more and more philanthropy to do things like AI and VR and really try to tie it back to helping our staff do a better job and better understand what they need to do. I think the other issue we're dealing with the vets is, as I've worked with them, it's easy to get pissed off at public education, in general, where we've not caught up to diversity and we're still teaching if it's in 1950. When you look at what happens in the military, it's devastating. The percentage of kids with developmental disabilities is much higher inside the veterans community. And I think one of the reasons there is the stress and anxiety of moving every 3 years. And, we're trying to get the vets, when we're doing work in DC, to just say, guys, this is insane. Why don't you're promoting something? And as I've worked with the 82nd Airborne, these are kids that I'm talking to, and we work with active duty folks, and there's never a group of 20, 30, 40, 50 of these guys who come and work with us where they don't quietly at the end say, I have a son with autism, and can you help us? So we're ready to hook up with TRICARE, and we'll probably start to design an opportunity for residential, options in our new children's specialty hospital, which is really going to be the first in the country that is designed to be sort of analogous to an urgent care center, where we get somebody in there, we figure them out and get them back home, and not look at placing people lifelong. And you need to do that with research and, again, a real understanding of brain-body connection and what's happening. And all of us are connected because so much of our work is tied to helping people that are trying to manage stress and anxiety, and so much of everything we're dealing with is more complicated because of that. And when you think of the military, they're in the middle of it all the time. So we're excited to work to get this stuff done. But I think, even moms being deployed and people not realizing, okay, traditional family stuff, and they just need to start to talk more about this stuff. It's right there in front of folks, and just say, let's see if we can tweak it a little bit and assist these families to, not be living with such stress and anxiety when they're deployed. So that's some of the stuff we're doing. My analogy always is, if I can get people who can work with us and be that poker player that just takes his chip and say, we're all in, then I think the work is going to be robust and it's going to move. We don't have a lot of time to bullshit around for 20 years. We've got to get stuff going. So, and I think the more we can come in, because all of this, we're all connected. The rate of suicide in autism is crazy, and in fact, when I was talking about lifespan, one of the things about lifespan with the autism spectrum, it's like 20 years less than other disability groups because of suicide. So it's like, wow, we've got to really connect. So
So, and I could not talk about it just in thinking that there's an assumption that it's already at the table, but since this is being filmed and since this is policy, again, my world is always making sure practice is aligned with policy. And this is great work of my colleagues within the military nonprofit space. So shout outs to Blue Star Families and NMFA. Our annual lifestyle survey tells us conditions around military family members, and to your point, we move every 2 to 3 years. So you have an opportunity. What we're best for policy is around the legislative advocacy and the storytelling. When I think about, and I kept thinking to myself, I love everything he's saying, but my family members aren't going to be able to access that if they're active duty, not just from a barrier around TRICARE, et cetera, but there is a systematic thing that needs to shift within the military policy-wise, and it is EFMP, Exceptional Family Member Program. And that is supposed to be a protective factor for our children. So if your child is on an educational plan, an IEP, your service member, mind you what I just said, your service member gets that rating for their family. I had a child, and I'm hoping I'm long enough down in this videotape that she won't watch this part because she doesn't like for me to share her story. But I had a child that was on, that first was not serviced, had educational delays, speech delays, and we moved, and during a time of combat, every 2 to 3 years. I could not keep her on a consistent IEP. We ultimately ended the service member's career around retirement because we knew for the best of our child, she was finally in a school district where she could be serviced. we were on the lucky end that we could just pop between educational needs, but I have friends that need what you have to provide. If their service member accepts that EFMP level at the level in which would require that service member not to accept orders, not to go overseas, not to take the command at which the military says to take it, their career's over. So it does no advantage to the family system. And let's remember, insurance now has aligned with the child's needs and services. So from a policy standpoint, we're pushing the conversation. And again, shout out to the organizations that are really doing the work. I've been grown underneath them, and so I appreciate the ability to speak to this. We're able to get the large DOD's attention around spouse unemployment and underemployment at about 26 to 28%, and looking at moving our families all the time around that, because the military spouse is unable to keep their career, we need 2 incomes, et cetera, et cetera. But from your perspective, you could push what you see, what you know that you could offer this community from just that EFMP classification. And Aaron, this is also your lane, so if you want to add in more to this, but from a policy perspective, we have to shift the way in which families are twofers in the system. They're dependents, they're a dash whatever. And so from your policy lens, I'd say this could be a huge action item that could come from this table that also would then align policy to your practice. Aaron, did you have any more you want to say around EFMP? And I hate to throw you out there.
The only thing I would add to that, and what I was consistently thinking through this, to Tina's point, is talking about the veterans, but the other piece of it is the veterans come with spouses, they come with caregivers, they come with family members, children, adult children, that there's like this big family unit that comes with them. And exactly like how Tina said, we're sometimes kind of I'm an active duty Navy spouse, that's why I'm saying we, are sometimes kind of the dash mark or the comma after, but I think the veterans' wellness and mental health is also very, very dependent on their family members' wellness and mental health as well. So it's both and instead of being a kind of a dot, dot, dot or a comma mark. So I would agree with that.
Things that we know if we fix them, particularly sleep deprivation and what's the cause of that. Sleep is a big deal. That we can focus on underlying issues that get people better. And so like we're hoping to be a place that sends that information out. Some of this stuff is doable if you pay attention to it. Sleep and gut issues are so connected. And if you calm that down, all of a sudden a lot of stress starts to, sort of dissipate. So there's actual practical things to do that everybody's overlooking. And we've got to get people to pay attention. If they're not sleeping, we got a problem here. It's only going to get worse.
I just want to add, we have some data now in a large randomized controlled trial showing that veterans with sleep apnea, show a significantly less response to these kind of trauma-focused exposure therapies. Because the idea is that you're relearning a response, a reaction or a response in these simulations or an imagination in traditional methods. And the brain needs to, in sleep, reconsolidate those memories and redefine the connections between the thought and the perception and the emotional reactivity. And people with apnea, a pretty gross measure of sleep disturbance, but still one nonetheless, show significantly poorer outcomes in these treatments. So maybe we just got to, get on the sleep train a little better if we want to see some of these, active treatments be more effective.
And the DOD should be at the top of the list with it. Performance and sleep are tied. And so if we could get the veterans group and DOD to focus on that, only even for combat folks, but for their families, that's a big deal. That's a big deal that we can get after, and the results are going to be, I think, amazing. And then once you regulate that, then you have to take a look at gut biome, you have to take a look at histamines, and there's a lot of reactivity here that's fixable. You can take care of it, you're paying attention to it. And maybe we have to alert, like the military, because again, they're all about performance, to make it sort of competitive that says, let's get this thing figured out.
let me just walk you through just a little project we're doing for the military. It's a mobile virtual human concierge wellness app, and I mentioned it before, but it's modeled after a program that the Army put out called the Performance Triad, which is the focus on sleep, nutrition, exercise, but all within a mental health context. So it's about building wellness and be all you can be, that kind of stuff. And their method of dissemination is these really beautiful, well graphically endowed, spiral-bound manuals that nobody reads. So they saw this, and so they scanned it and put it on a website. So now you scroll on the website through the same text-heavy and beautiful graphics to go along content. Then they said, well, let's make a mobile app. And a mobile app is basically you pop it up and you turn pages by hitting buttons rather than the manual. Nothing engaged. So our pitch was, we use a virtual human to engage people on a regular basis. One of the things that we're working on in the sleep area is that, as I'm saying now, the Army owns you, so they can invade your privacy. You got to opt in anywhere else. But the GPS on the phone can monitor where the hell you're going. So the use case would be the phone detects that the service member is sitting in the same bar every night till 2 in the morning, and up at 6 for physical training. So that would be a critical incident that the character would pop up aside from the standard, daily check-in thing. And the character would come up, not hammer him on his drinking initially, but pop up and say, hey, I've been watching your sleep over the last week. You're in sleep debt. You got 4 hours here, and from your Fitbit, the sleep isn't that good, So why don't we do this? I'm going to pop up a quick test on your phone, a quick reaction time speed of processing test. And it's going to be like a game. And so it pops up and you got to hit when you see, a rabbit, or you hit when you see a letter, or whatever it is. And I'm going to record this speed of processing, and the next time you get 6 hours sleep, I'm going to pop back up again, and let's do it again, and let's just see what the difference is. And and that's all doable. It's not technologically infeasible. But those kinds of strategies to engage a user in something that reflects their own performance, and more than hollering at them about drinking or saying, hey, you need your sleep, now, and that's where I see the power of these kinds of things, all privacy concerns aside, but, and as far as you mentioned suicide prevention planning, which the VA is introducing now. When you see someone at risk, well, that's great. You've got to train VA people in how to do this properly, but maybe you implement a tech connection. It's going beyond the VR, more the mobile networking thing, but where if that person is in one of those critical incidents or critical settings where they've already noted to be at risk, maybe they got a fallback if they don't have somebody around them with a virtual character or some kind of an engaging activity. Here's a reminder of your safety.
Hi, so I do have one question for you, Stan, since you're doing work with Los Angeles and San Diego. I'm curious to know if there's any policy changes being discussed with the suicide prevention offices in the emergency room, because many people who are feeling suicidal, or if someone knows someone who's suicidal, they're told to go to the emergency room. And I had the opportunity to work with patients who were suicidal in the emergency room, and in many instances, those folks were re-traumatized just having to wait for care. And so I'm curious to know if there's any steps being taken to start care in the emergency room, since so many of those patients end up waiting there for a day, 2, 3 days sometimes. And they're working with providers who do not have any requirements to actually have psychiatric backgrounds.
Thanks for the question. And yes, we are. It's not going as quickly as we want it to. I would say Riverside County here in California probably has the best system. The language that we want to focus on is stabilization and linkages in the least restrictive setting. And so Riverside County is following a model out of Arizona called Crisis Now, which is rather than having emergency rooms, in Riverside they have mental health urgent care. So you can walk in, if law enforcement is the one who does the transport, they can bring them there. They don't have to sit there for hours. they're getting treatment or support or interventions, whatever, that meet them where they're at, rather than, like you said, in the traumatization of the emergency room setting. But we also need to, in the school settings, we are also looking at, instead of engaging law enforcement, you think of the traditional, if a youth is identified at risk of suicide, since that counselor likely hasn't had training, they immediately call a crisis response team, which then engages law enforcement. Law enforcement comes up, lights and siren, kids and handcuffed, put in the back of a car. Every kid on the school is watching. So not only are they traumatized in the hospital setting, they're traumatized before they even get to the hospital. And so you really have to look at it first. And the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale is one of the gold standards out there for screening and assessment. But we need to, again, it comes back to this demystification. We simply can't wait. We can't say that only mental health professionals can screen for suicide risk. If we do, we have 10 million people in America who are going to be suicidal this year. We don't have the mental health army that we would need to respond to that. So we need to demystify it and allow that the skill of screening whether or not, like how level of risk people have, you don't need 8 years of schooling to get that. You need a simple, comprehensive, concise, tight training. So I think it starts with the assessment portion, being able to better defer. And then we were talking about policy, if I could make one policy recommendation, it would be that so much of what we do to care for people who are suicidal or having thoughts of suicide is based on a liability mindset. It's not patient-centered. What does this person need to keep them safe? So if I could make one law, it would be kind of a Good Samaritan law for suicide, that if someone has training and they did the best of what they thought was best for that individual, and God forbid something happened to that individual, they would be protected. So I don't know if that was the answer to your question, but I guess the response is Crisis Now is a wonderful model to get people in the least restrictive settings.
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to throw something out there and make a statement. In my practice, I'm exploring a lot of QEEG work with my populations. I'm mainly in pediatrics. So what that is, it's a 20-minute brain scan where we can actually see what's happening with the brainwave state and if there's any TBIs or anything structurally impacting the brain. So I'm thinking when we're talking about physiology and with your VR work, like, are you doing pre and post brain scans to identify if maybe a person isn't responding because not only of sleep apnea, but maybe a TBI that's not being addressed, and incorporating neurofeedback and neurostimulation into these practices. I've seen it have extreme benefit for children as well as individuals with post-traumatic stress. So, yeah, I'm wondering if you're utilizing any of those.
We have one study where very primitive, just pre-post fMRI, looking at before and after treatment, and presenting in the magnet a projection of combat simulation and so forth. And what you do is you see that after treatment, you see changes in brain activation when confronted with these stimuli. So less activation in the amygdala, some areas of the frontal lobe less, but also more activation for emotional control. So we've got preliminary data, maybe 28 people doing that. The challenge with the physio stuff is the cost to do it, and to do it with good signals, good capture. Because there are some low-cost systems that are out there that allege to capture EEG, but it's very noisy, and so but this is where we got to go. I mean, the brain behavior relationships. That's where we're going to get a deeper understanding of what's going on up here, but not forget about behavior as well. So.
You asked the question about what's next for the future. It's imaging technology. Our imaging technology is about 40 years old. I mean, it's old stuff. And there's this HARPA is happening somewhere, but if we improve imaging, we see cancer before cancer becomes cancer. We see the spinal fluid flowing in and out of the brain and heavy metals. So to me, if I had $1 trillion imaging, just scan the shit out of us and let's figure it out.
What about, they got blood pressure tests at CVS's, What if we can bring that technology to a level where you go in and you put 50 cents in a machine or whatever it is, and you stand there and you get a full-on scan that might not be as extremely precise, but is enough to point out something. And that becomes just like, get your blood pressure checked.
So on that note, I'm talking to the head of Northwell Health, the largest health system in the East. And I said to him, what's next for you? Who's your competition? And he goes, CVS. And I go, why? He goes, because they have parking lots. And it's efficient for people to come, park, and get care, not go to a hospital and go underground and go all over the place. And he was dead serious. And they just bought Walgreens. So I go, I guess he's going after it. But but to your point, it's access that give people an opportunity to do it.
You know what, before Bob closes, just an observation. This is always inspiring, but with such an eclectic group. I heard two things, kind of the common denominator. There is more hope that came out of this discussion than I've heard in a lot of other discussions. And that's something I think people in general, audiences, when they watch TVs or movies, I think there's fatigue about the despair and the lack of possibility and the lack of hope. Parallel to that is your points bringing up, how do I, as a mom, as a wife, how do I trust? I might go into CVS and put my arm in that sleeve because I sort of have a trust level and I'm not going to get hurt, and I probably check it up with but how do we trust systems that have failed us in the past, seriously failed us? How do we bring that trust back? And I hope we can look at opportunities for media portrayals when people are parking their cars at home and going in and just zoning in and binging on this Crown or whatever other show we happen to be watching. But how do we get those stories in there so that they're familiar and I start to get it in the kind of language, Stan, that you and I've worked on in the past, where language of hope and possibilities. So I'm so appreciative of everybody here.
But that I think goes to exactly what you were talking about trust, and something that I kept thinking about as everyone was talking, and Stan touched on it a little bit, but is this idea of we have these general barriers, but then we also kind of need to look to barriers for like the community of people of color, the community of the LGBTQ community, like looking at what our big barriers are, and I think how we then grow trust with all of these communities that come after it and what those specific barriers are for communities to accessing services or treatment or whatever it is. And I think trust is a big part of that. And how do we advertise to communities that our services, our treatments, our providers are safe?
Thank you, everybody. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to the audience. I think it was a great discourse. If I learned anything from my years in Washington is that you need to take action after you come around the horn with all these discussions. And so we'll try to really see where there may be some follow-up, whether it's actually going back to you or going back or doing some cross-pollination with some of the governmental agencies or the private sector. So, and we have some follow-up, I know, from our previous one that we did in Washington in mid-October. But a round of applause to our panelists.
And Bob, could I
Patrick.
just
Yes, sir.
close? Don't underestimate the power of kindness in this work. I actually think that's it. Fierce kindness, and that's a martial art done right, and don't underestimate it. It's what you're talking about. It's what, when you look at the brilliant staff working, it's that connection, that kind connection with people is what helps people heal and get better.
That may be the lead.
One last thing. In February, I believe, we're in the planning, but we're going to have a half-day event at our center in Los Angeles, followed by a cocktail hour demo session. So it'll probably be something like from noon to 7 or 8 type event. And so if there's some connection where I can share that information, if you're in LA or you want to come up, you can hang out and hear people talk about these issues and the science and try the stuff.
That's it. Yeah. How about if we share that with everybody? Oh no, my pleasure. Well, the only thing I ask is that you go to the concert tonight, enjoy yourselves, tune in on December 27th. But seriously, we'll follow up, and as you go to our website, you'll see that the previous roundtables have been posted, and I just can't thank everybody enough. So enjoy the weather, enjoy the concert.